Hi there. Welcome to The PrevenTable, the podcast giving you a seat at the table with conversations about the intersection of alcohol, drugs, and mental health in everyday lives. Take a seat and join us.
Welcome to The PrevenTable. Today's episode is brought to you by our amazing friends at Hubbard, who give us this awesome studio twice a month, if you can believe that. And they're just really great partners. So shout out to them. They have really allowed this podcast to be what it is today. So we're really appreciative. And speaking of today, with me today is Alexander Hatoum. He is an assistant professor at WashU, and we sort of Google stalked you to have you come in and tell us more about what you're doing. So thank you for saying yes. Happy that you're here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, Alexander, okay. We were talking before we started recording, and I kept saying, stop, because I want to keep this, I want to find out in real time. So the reason, first of all, that you're here is because you and a lot of other co-authors have put out a pretty incredible, expansive study, right, about human genomes and substance use disorder. Correct?
Yeah.
Kind of. Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
That's correct. Yeah.
Can you talk to me about the purpose of the study? How did we get to the study? We don't have to talk about what you found yet, but just talk to me about the purpose of the study.
Right. So we know that part of the risk for substance use disorders is due to inherited genetic liability.
Correct.
So I'm not going to say that it's like a genetic disease like cystic fibrosis, right? We're going to say that people have certain genetic variants will have an increased risk.
So just because your dad had a substance use disorder doesn't mean that you will, but it puts you at a higher risk.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. And so we're interested in that. We're interested in specifically this genetic risk factor, and we want to know biologically, what are you inheriting, right? What is the molecular processes that might be different in someone who inherits this risk to addiction and then manifests addiction, right? And so in order to do that, we take samples from around the globe and we combine them into a single analysis. And in each of these samples, what they've done is they've scanned individuals with a substance use disorder and without a substance use disorder. And then they've done a scan for what genetic variants might be associated with the substance use disorder.
And when you say comparing people that have a substance use disorder and do not, we're talking that they meet the diagnostic criteria. So the DSM, they meet diagnostic criteria.
Yeah,
DSM,
DSM, ICD code, this is global. So there's several different
I see,
people
right,
use,
okay.
But yeah, essentially similar to the DSM. They have to have criteria for the disorder. And a lot of the samples, the people who are controls that we're comparing to, they've had some sort of exposure, right? So they're not just, the controls aren't just people who have never tried opiates. These are people who have been prescribed opioids but did not progress to developing opioid use disorder, for example.
Oh, or somebody who drinks, 3 nights a week but has not developed an alcohol use disorder or something.
Yeah, they'd be a control.
Okay, excellent. So you have the control group or you have people who have the substance use disorder and people who do not have a substance use disorder. Mm-hmm. And now you're really diving in and looking at the genes.
Yeah, and so thanks to human gene mapping being what it is now, we can actually do a scan across the whole genome. And so rather than have a hypothesis about what molecular mechanisms are there, we can scan the whole genome and then figure out which specific areas of the genome are associated. So what are the areas of the genome that distinguish people with and without a substance use disorder?
Not to be an idiot here. So you might have to break this down for me. When you say that you are scanning the human genome, what does that mean?
Yeah, so at each area of the genome, you're going to have different alleles. Okay, so people will inherit, some areas will vary across individuals. And so those areas in which there is variability, you will either have an A or you will have an alternative allele like a G, a C, or a T.
What is an allele if somebody is listening and has no idea what you're talking about?
So that is the smallest piece of the genome. So the genome can essentially be broken up into its smallest pieces, which are on each side there you will have 2 alleles, one you inherit from your father and one you inherit from your mother, right? And so what we're essentially trying to do is see if people have one allele versus another at any given point. We run a model at every single of the millions of points, we say if you have this allele versus this allele, then are you at higher risk? And then we move to the next little point and run it again. And so we're just running millions of models.
And you're doing this all across the world.
Yeah, so every person who gets funding to study this has their own sample, and then they run it in their own sample. And then they give their sample to us, and we combine all of their little studies into one large-scale study.
Who funded this large-scale study?
So the large-scale study was funded by the National Institutes of Health, specifically the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and then I'm funded by the National Institute for Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse. Those aren't my favorite names, person-centered language being what they are. Yeah, but
it's kind of like SAMHSA. It's like, like we're still using the word abuse, and that's one of the reasons why we ended up changing our name. But it is what it is. So, okay. So you get this funding, and I think what some people probably don't realize who are listening, who've never had an experience with a research study, is like, it doesn't just happen, right? You have to apply for the funding. That takes a while. You have to get approval to do it. So this has been in the works for quite some time, right? And how long has it been in the works for?
I mean, the first few studies that go into this sample, some of them are as old as 2009.
Oh, no way.
I took over the data and started combining all the analyses about 4 years ago.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. And you published the research a couple months ago?
Yeah, about 2 months ago it was finally published.
Whoa. So it really, I mean, you kind of are speaking our love language. Like when we talk about prevention, we're saying like that's not something that pays off immediately. Like you're doing this work, and there's a long runway there.
Yeah, that's how science is.
Yep.
It's a lot of slow, careful work to get to the next step. And I benefit from the fact that a lot of people did slow, careful work before me, and then I come in and take all of the glory by combining all of the data, right? So
yeah, and I have no I don't get funded by WashU or anything like that, but what's crazy to me that I don't know that people understand is that WashU does an incredible amount of research into substance use disorders.
Yeah,
like an incredible amount. Is that through one particular school? Is that a particular priority that the school has, or do you know?
I think it's just that the people with that interest find each other, and then we found each other at St. Louis,
Interesting.
It's also one of the top medical schools in the country, so you're going to find a lot of research in a lot of areas there, right? Like there's a lot of substance use disorder research, but the psychiatry department in general is just a fantastic research environment. So you're going to find other psychiatric disorder research there. And then, Siteman Center, you're going to find a lot in cancer.
True.
And then people who are studying cancer are inherently going to be interested in substance use disorders at one point because heavy use increases your risk.
Right.
So, research feeds into other research. And so you're at a great environment like WashU, you're going to find a lot of great things.
Are you from here?
I am not.
Okay, so you came here specifically for the research that was happening and exactly what you're describing.
Yeah, so my mentor, Arpana Agarwal, she runs a training grant.
Yes.
That recruited me to study substance use disorders.
She's a friend of the agency. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Okay, yeah, so you know her. Yes, she's fantastic. She runs a training grant, and she was basically called me up and was like, hey, do you want to come here for this program? I know you've studied. I started in more neuroscience-based phenotypes, cognitive neuroscience ones, and she was offering to retrain me in addiction.
Huh.
And so this project I proposed to her, I was like, well, actually, I do have an interest in addiction, and this is what I'd like to do, is this project where we combine data across the world into this single factor. And she was like, sure, okay, come here, we'll teach you about addiction. And that's how I ended up coming to WashU. Okay,
so we will get to the findings of your study in just a few moments, but I think it's so cool because there's a lot of kids when they are in kindergarten, like my niece, for example, she wants to be an astrophysicist. Maybe she will be an astrophysicist. She's been wanting to do that for a long time, which is a very niche, But there's a lot of kids that are they watch Bill Nye the Science Guy or Mr. Wizard or whatever, and they're like, I want to be a scientist when I grow up. I want to be you're doing it. Have you always wanted to do this?
For a while, I wanted to be a naturalist.
What is that?
A naturalist is like a scientist, but in nature.
Okay. Like a naturalist. Okay, I get it. Okay.
I wanted to be a scientist that went into the Amazon and explored things.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Or Great Barrier Reef. But I've always liked science. And then as I got older, I wanted to be an inventor, and I was like interested in that. But then I slowly found my way into behavioral genetics because I became interested in behavior, animal behavior, human behavior in undergrad. And and then I worked in labs in undergrad. And if anyone ever wants to be a scientist, the number one thing you can do, go to a major research university, volunteer in labs.
In a lab. Yeah.
And you'll find a niche, you'll find research you're good at.
And I've heard like it's not exactly like the most exciting thing, but you kind of like need to have some lab experience so that you can really figure out like what area is interesting to you, right? Yeah. And how you might want to run a lab someday when you're running a lab. So, yeah. So you were interested in human behavior, animal behavior, and you also said that you had an interest in addiction and substance use disorder. If you don't mind my asking, like where did that come from, or did that just like you just found it fascinating?
A multitude of factors. So first, I found it fascinating just from the start. Like, it is just an interesting area of work. But I was starting to discover research, behavior, genetics all around the time where people begin developing substance use disorders, on that age group where my friends were beginning to develop those disorders, right? So as a person with a scientific mind, you start to
wonder why.
Yeah, you start to look at their relatives, look at them, and you start to question: is this what's going on here? Like, why is it happening at this age? Why is it happening to certain people? Like, this person has a very similar experience to me. Like, what is the difference here that's happening with them? And so it becomes an interest in both your life, and then it becomes an interest in your research.
Wow.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say research is research in every context for addiction. Like, I feel like people can just see others and then become interested in addiction research. But I think it's an important area of study because we know that as people age, that early on it's one of the biggest risk factors for those earlier morbidity factors that people see is substance use and substance use disorders.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So and if you're a young person, that's kind of what you're surrounded with at the time.
Yep. And it's all about your peers and what's happening and what are they doing. And when we talk to kids, because we, as I think we go into classrooms beginning in kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade. Now, obviously, we're not talking to kindergartners about drugs, but when we talk to middle schoolers and high schoolers about risk factors for substance use, we always drive home the fact, like we always say, like, what do you think the number one risk factor is? And people are always like, well, like genetics, or, well, if you were a survivor of some sort of abuse. And like, yes, like trauma, definitely it's, that it's related. Definitely. We know that if somebody uses before the age of 15 while their brain is still, being hardwired and still very under construction, we know that that's a huge risk factor. And heritability, right? Am I saying that right? Which is like if your parents, am I using it?
Your inherited risk for.
Okay.
Yeah. Heritability is kind of like the population's general risk. So just, did you inherit risk for substance use disorder? Family history.
Family history. Yeah. Just like with COPD or diabetes or whatever. What's the family history, the risk for substance use disorders? Okay. So tell me what your research has found and break it down for the people who are listening and like, in layman's terms, tell us what you found.
Okay, so let's take a quick step back.
Yes.
Substance use disorders are heritable. There is some effect of genetics in influencing whether or not an individual in the population will develop a substance use disorder.
Okay.
So we know that genetics are important from years of twin and family studies, and then we've done all these large-scale genomic studies in specific substances, right? So we have a study in cannabis use disorder, opioid use disorder, alcohol use disorder, and tobacco use disorder, right? But when we think about substance use disorders in the clinic and in research, we often split them into like a particular drug.
Yes, right. It drives me nuts, right? Yeah. And usually that's based on where the money is. Let's be real, right? So it's like there was a lot of research around opioid use disorder when the opioid epidemic kind of hit. And now I think we're trying to catch up with some of the cannabis research because of what's happening around legalization. So yeah, it's been very drug specific. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also because clinical trials, it's just easier to stick with an individual with a single substance use disorder.
But most people don't use a single substance.
Exactly.
Like most people are poly users, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And not only that, but people who are poly users and people who meet criteria in particular, who are polysubstance use disorder cases, they have worse outcomes. They're the people really in need of treatment, and then they're the people often ignored by genetic and clinical research.
Yeah, they're not the person who's like having a couple of beers with their friend like a couple of nights a week and then can like turn it off and don't have any damage to their lives. This isn't the person who like goes on a float trip and smokes some weed. Like these are people who are heavily using and it's impacting their lives.
Yeah. And they're also at risk for other issues due to the substance use
absolutely.
disorder. Right. And so these are the people who are worse off, yet research hasn't always covered them. So the idea was, okay, well, we have all these individual studies. Can we use statistical models in order to combine the information and gain some sort of insight into this broader addiction risk? And so that's what we did. We developed something that we called the addiction risk factor model. And what this does is it splits up these biological risk into, this is a general like risk towards using substances versus these specific risk factors that might direct you towards a certain substance. Right. So there's there's this general risk, which we found was a dopaminergic regulatory system where some
Say that again slower.
Yeah, which is kind of like a dopaminergic regulatory system. So it's genes that influence your intake and response to reward.
Dopamine, the pleasure neurotransmitter.
Right,
yes.
right.
Okay.
And so it's things that regulate dopamine even more, even broader than that. And then we noticed for specific substances, it was things that tended to like bind or influence that substance. So for example, it's genes in your liver that process alcohol that might lead you more likely to be someone who uses alcohol or develop an alcohol use disorder versus another substance use disorder.
So it's not the brain, it's your liver?
Well, the brain is also involved. So the brain is here in this general addiction factor. And then there are specific brain and liver factors for alcohol. But the biggest genetic risk factor specific to alcohol does deal with some of these liver metabolizing genes.
Okay.
Right? Whereas this general addiction risk, that's all going to be largely neurological.
Right.
And then, but like if you look at tobacco, the largest risk factor are genes that influence nicotinic receptors. So receptors that make nicotine more pleasurable are going to be the things that lead you towards selecting, say, tobacco or having a tobacco use disorder. So there's this general and then specific risks. Right. And that's what we found. So we essentially have 5 different molecular patterns, processes that we can study now. One for each of these substances, opioids, cannabis, tobacco, and alcohol, and then this broad addiction risk that influences all of these individual disorders and then people's risk factors towards selecting multiple substances. And so we're able to create those 2 patterns. And it's a very data-driven study. So you can create those patterns and then you can say, okay, now what relates to those patterns? Well, we know addiction relates to them, but is there anything that relates in the reverse that's like a medication or a treatment? Right? Clinical studies historically don't study the polysubstance use disorder dimension, but what if we can say, look, this is something that will most likely target that dimension? Can we start to engage in clinical trials? Can we improve our chances that clinical trials will become successful? And genetic data is great at doing that. It's great at telling you, look, this is where you can drill down for new treatments. And so the rest of the study followed up on those patterns to try and find out what are the most likely effective treatments that could be extended from understanding the biology of substance use disorders generally and then for each specific disorder.
So is that where you like dove into things like Vivitrol or things like that? Did you get that specific? Or not necessarily?
We tested about 840 drugs, so I don't actually have off the top of my head which were successful.
It's okay. I was just, but like as an example, were those types of things you looked at?
Yeah, like think of varenicline or the name of Chantix, you know?
Yeah, sure, for smoking, yeah.
Yeah, that came up, right? And we were able to test the efficacy and support of most current medications for substance use disorders and then say, look, there's also other medications on here that show a similar degree of support in terms of the molecular evidence. So those would be a good, fruitful area of future research in order to look for treatments that target this like broader dimension that might help with polysubstance use disorders.
So you mentioned, I mean, you're sort of like right where my brain is going. Like, what does this study, what does it lead us to in the future? And so you said one thing might be like looking at other medications that might be effective in treating. Are there other sort of possibilities that this study has opened up? And where is your brain going in terms of next steps for you?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. So this next one, I'll give a warning that you have to be very careful with where your brain goes with genetic testing, because we can develop polygenic risk scores from this kind of data and say, okay, this is this person's genetic risk. Not everyone who has a high genetic risk will develop the substance use disorder, right? So we're thinking about patient stratification more so than like, okay, this person has a substance use disorder. Now can we use this genetic data to tell us more about what treatments will help that individual, rather than like the dystopian thing of thinking beforehand, like, oh, this person's going to develop a substance use disorder.
So it's like kind of like with breast cancer, right? So with women, there's, I don't know the exact specifics, but there's like a gene, right? And if you have the gene, it makes you more likely to develop a particularly aggressive, deadly form of breast cancer. So what some people do with that information is that then they just go ahead and they get a mastectomy. That's not necessarily what I'm hearing you say. You're saying if this gene is identified, not doomsday prepper, I'm going to develop a substance use disorder, but maybe what can I do to alter my lifestyle maybe to where that doesn't necessarily happen, but B, if it does happen, here would be some treatments that could help me manage that.
Right. So we're looking more in the context of, I guess to put it more simply, we're looking more in the context of how do we help people who already have developed a substance use disorder, and what does this tell us? And you can use this for a lot of different research purposes. One is treatments.
Yeah.
Another is looking at things like self-medication, right? Like, so self-medication relates strongly to the addiction risk factor.
Sure.
Right. Of course it does.
If you're self-medicating to cope with stress or uncomfortable feelings or trauma.
Yeah, exactly. We also know that people who self-medicate, they're not using drugs that would necessarily treat the problem that they're experiencing, right? So we can ask questions about the degree to which self-medication is due to maybe a general addiction risk factor, or people who are self-medicating going towards this addiction pathway versus a more psychiatric pathway, right? Like what might be the etiological cause of their specific dysfunction. I think those are the kinds of questions that our research is taking us to. And we don't have answers for those yet.
Yeah, sure, right.
That's where I think we're going to go in the future, is more with this, how can we stratify people to figure out what is the cause of their problem?
Would there be a way, because I'm all about prevention, Prevent+Ed is all about prevention, is there any interest in looking at your study and thinking about how we could get in front of it, or not yet? Yeah,
so there is. Of course, there always is with genetic data.
Well, you say of course, but not everybody is like, all about prevention. So.
Right. We always have to be careful when it comes to prevention in terms of using genetic data. So I've published on this with opioid use disorder before. But if you use a model without knowing like the other risk factors, especially the demographic risk factors.
Interesting.
You run the risk of falsely classifying people as they will suffer from a substance use disorder. So you have to be incredibly careful with prevention in terms of trying to predict, like, in terms of this omnipotent, like, genetic predictor, right? Because it just doesn't exist.
Yes.
There's many risk factors.
It's a lot of things going into it. It's like when schools will label kiddos at risk and we'll put them in certain buckets, certain groups, because they, fill in X, check box or whatever. Yeah. But that is discounting maybe a lot of other things that are going on. So I think what you're saying is you don't want to put people in buckets based on genetic information only, because there's a lot of other things that go into the mix.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to. So
this is just fascinating.
Patient stratification.
Are you the life of the party at parties?
I'm pretty much a nerd, so.
Well, I just think this is amazing. Okay.
I mean, I'm the guy who everyone's talking about, like, one of the most interesting topics, which is like drugs and addiction. And I'm like, oh, I studied that here, dopaminergic signaling. Everyone's like, all right, bye.
They're like, peace out. Like,
it's like, that's not what I want to. I want to talk about whiskey, but not like that.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Wow.
So, but yeah, I mean, like, it is interesting where we can go with this research.
Yeah.
And what the practical applications of genetic work are. But I'm not sure that it's like we said at the beginning. It's going to take very careful, slow processes in order to guarantee that this works. And we need community partners like you guys, because we need to ensure that we aren't just jumping into something and saying like, okay, we're going to completely change and disrupt the way addiction is handled.
Totally.
Because that's just going to miss people, right?
Right.
Like,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. So I'm switching gears a smidge, but not really, because you were talking about the fact that you're also, you have a lot of titles, which I totally appreciate because you've worked your butt off for those titles. So good for you. And one of the things that you're researching or a professor of is artificial intelligence.
I started working with, I've gained an affiliation at the Artificial Intelligence and the Internet of Things in Medicine Institute at WashU, which is a recent project that WashU has undertaken.
And you were talking about the, I guess, risks of using artificial intelligence for some treatment modalities.
Yeah. So we can talk about this because this is an area I've published on before as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is like, you can come to any party I'm hosting because I find this very fascinating. Keep talking.
Yeah, so I specifically looked at models of opioid use disorder. So let's go back to this naive idea. So somebody who has less of an understanding of substance use disorder, of substance use, just of individuals that suffer from these disorders will think, okay, well, clearly the problem is just in the opioid itself. And if somebody with high genetic risk takes an opioid, boom, they're going to move towards addiction.
Correct.
Which is an oversimplification, right? We know that there's more complicated factors involved in prevention than just them taking that opioid.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
Correct.
Now, the idea has been that if you can create a model that will help you somehow understand that you could just say, no, this person shouldn't take an opioid. But then you might also be denying patients, like pain patients.
Yeah, right,
treatment.
Exactly.
Right.
Which we saw as the pendulum swung from like, well, let's just deny people from getting the medicine. And it's like, well, now we're, causing people to go elsewhere, or we're like denying their legitimate pain that they're in and making them go without. So how do we do something in between? Right.
Exactly. And so that nuance, that do something in between, that's what organizations like what you guys do. And that's vital. Now, what people are trying to do to disrupt is say, oh, I can just create a model from genetic data and then let the AI figure it out. The AIs do not figure out good answers to these problems yet. Okay, and that's what I've essentially published on. So if you attempt to train a machine learning model, is what we typically call AI in the literature.
Machine learning model,
yeah.
Okay.
If you attempt to train a machine learning model with naive to population stratification, like the way that people tend to cluster in populations, and if you use genetic variants, what you end up doing is misclassifying individuals. And what's worse is that the individuals that are most likely to be misclassified are populations of individuals from minoritized groups. That's because people from minoritized groups typically are more mixtures of different populations. Like they have ancestry from Europeans because of the Europeans took advantage of their ancestors. Well, they also have ancestry from other geographic nationalities because they were brought here. So then the models pick up that. If you have a sample in which there's any imbalance in looking at people of minoritized populations, they pick up, oh, the minoritized populations have an imbalance, therefore my genetic model is just going to predict that, and you're going to get false prediction, right? You have to control for these processes of population stratification, and in the short run, and in the long run, you have to have at least some sort of nuance to the way in which you train the models and think about the context of their deployment, right? Otherwise, you're just going to hurt people when you're trying to do good.
So you're saying like robots are not the answer in this work?
Yeah, robots are not the answer.
They could be part of, maybe.
Yeah, I have a saying at WashU that I like to tell people, which is we don't need robots, we need cyborgs. You don't want to replace the individual who's treating a substance use disorder. You want to augment their ability to treat the substance use disorder. You want to improve their ability to make the right decisions, but you don't want to take away the decision rights from them and give it to an algorithm, right? And that is...
I think we just found our podcast title. So we don't need robots, we need cyborgs.
Yes. Oh, it's two separate topics here. There's also the larger addiction study.
Right, yeah. Of course. Wow. I mean, you realize, like, the amazing, and I'm not just blowing smoke up your butt, but like, do you realize like the amazingly groundbreaking work you're doing for this field?
I appreciate you saying that. I mean, it's not just me. I have a lot of strong collaborators. There's 180 people on my paper with me, all of which fantastic people, I have to say. And I'm not just saying that because they're scattered all over the world and I like to travel the world. They really are great people.
Yeah. But I mean, do you guys like ever sit back with like, you know, an NA cocktail and you're like, hey, like we're doing some good here?
We try to do good, but we're also just naturally curious people. We're like dogs chasing our tails sometimes. It's like we're never going to catch it, but we're going to keep trying because that's what research is. You know, you have an answer, but then there were these limitations and then there's future questions. And so I feel like we do spend a lot of time looking on the horizon. But yeah, I do like the research. I do like, it's fun. I have fun doing it. My favorite days are the days where I just get to sit and analyze data, you know? So.
Well, really and truthfully, like on behalf of the field, thank you to your collaborators on all of these studies that you're talking about. I mean, you are helping us think through how to prevent, intervene, treat, recover from, manage, fill in the verb here. Like you are helping us tackle the substance use disorder. You could say crisis, you could say epidemic, whatever, but it impacts everybody. Like, let's just be real, you know? So the fact that you all are doing the work, that WashU and NIH and folks like that are funding it and are committed to making it happen, like, that's just pretty damn cool. So thank you.
Well, thank you guys too. I mean, you're doing the practical work, right? I'm more than just an ivory tower elitist because I can talk to people like you. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's really cool, and it really is a partnership. So thank you so much for being here. If people wanted to read the study, like where would they find it? How would they? I mean, I guess we could link to it, but is it in a journal?
It is in a journal, and currently it is behind a paywall. I have submitted it to the federal government to go after. Yeah, cool. So it will be out of the paywall, hopefully in 3 to 4 months. I've worked very hard to try to ensure that it gets around that and into the public eye. So there's that. If you go to my Twitter, there is a complete summary with images of the figures.
All right, what's your Twitter? Promote it.
Accessible. It's Alexander Hatoum. So yeah, just.
Do you have a blue check mark?
I do not have a blue check
I don't
mark.
Either. It's fine.
No,
it's fine. I'm not paying for it.
Yeah, I'm not either. I don't have that many followers. I like to summarize the paper. I just wanted to make it accessible however I could. And then if you look at my name, there's also a preprint that is free on BioArchive. And that's not the final version of the paper, but you can read it and get a lot of the information.
Yeah, you can get the gist.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. I mean, I've learned so much. Really appreciate it. If you liked what you heard, if you want more with people like Alexander, please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing to The PrevenTable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us at The PrevenTable, brought to you ad-free by Prevent+Ed. Prevent+Ed works to reduce or prevent the harms of alcohol and other drug use through education, intervention, and advocacy. Please visit their website at PreventEd.org. Like what you heard? Rate, review, and subscribe to stay up to date with what we are serving on The PrevenTable.